Hey guys, it's Eric Green. Listen, how do I make sure that all these potential clients sign my letter and pay me before we start doing work? I use Anchor. Anchor created a fully autonomous billing system and closes the cycle with zero errors. It sends our agreement to the potential client. We'll follow up with them automatically to make sure that agreement is signed. It alerts us when it gets read, when it's signed, and when payment is made. And this way, you know where you are every step of the way. I was so impressed with Anchor, which, by the way, is free. We went to Anchor and have partnered with them. Now, if you go and you register with Anchor, which is free, by the way, if I didn't mention that, you will get access to all of our checklists and letters, okay? But you have to go through our link, all right? Again, by the way, Anchor's free. There is a $5 fee per transaction if you're wondering how they make money. But given that our minimum retainer is $750, it's less than 1%. It's nothing, okay? So again, it's free. They charge the $5, transaction fee on payments, and it will automate your onboarding clients, make follow-up, just puts it on autopilot. It just saves you all that stress and you will close more deals. All right. So sign up here. It's www.sayanchor.com/tax rep. Again, sayanchor.com, sayanchor.com/tax rep, TAXREP. When you go through there, you'll sign up for free and you will have access to all of our letters and checklists, which will save you the trouble of recreating them yourself. All right. Go check out Anchor and put that closing process on autopilot. Guys, I've told my horror story before with S Corp clients and how do you know what reasonable comp is? My horror story is when they went after that CPA who was a friend of mine for $125,000, arguing that he knew and that he knew better and that he should have made sure his clients took reasonable comp. I'm a huge fan of RC reports. RC reports, it's about $1,400 a year. We're charging the S Corps that come to us under audit $750 a piece. We'll probably make between $10,000 and $20,000 with RC reports. But if you have S Corp or C Corp clients, they have to each year get a report, and the report is as simple as possible. RC Reports has a huge database of businesses. It will give you a report that you can rely on. And so far, to date, when we produce that report, not a single auditor has challenged it. The critical thing right now is for your clients to get that report to support the number they're taking on the return, that you're taking on that return that you're signing. Best way to do it, RC Reports. Go check it out, okay? You can find them. It's trn.rcreports.com. Again, trn.rcreports.com. Go there, you'll save $100. It will change your practice. We create an annuity stream for you and bulletproof your clients' corporate returns. The Tax Rep podcast is now proudly partnered with Nice Job, the experts in reputation marketing. Reviews are so important for attracting new clients. Before Nice Job, I would ask people to leave reviews, but they would usually forget, and I didn't have a way to stay on top and remember to follow up with them. That's where Nice Job comes in. Their smart follow-up campaign recognizes who hasn't left a review yet and automatically sends carefully timed reminders that can increase your chances of getting a review by 300%. I tried Nice Job for Tax Rep, and it's been a game changer. We added 33 five-star reviews in our first month, and our Google business profile is like a magnet for new customers. You can try Nice Job for free for 14 days and get 50% off your first 3 months by visiting nicejob.grsm.io/taxrep. nicejob.grsm.io/taxrep. I'm going to put a link in the description of the podcast. Try it. It will be a game changer for your business as well. How do I manage my tax rep practice? How do I get transcripts? How do I track what is going on with the IRS with every single one of my client cases? How do we complete the offer forms, the powers of attorney, everything? We use Tax Help software. Tax Help software is the cornerstone of our practice. We use it for its intelligent ordering. Every single night, it will update the transcripts on our clients, so we will see things happen long before those letters even go to the mail. We can then, react. We can let the client know. We can get all the transcripts we need to determine what our client's best options are, when is the debt going to expire, and we can fill in all of the IRS forms and get them filed accurately, the analysis done correctly. If you're interested in giving it a test, go to taxhelpsoftware.com, use promo code TaxRepTrial, all one word, all caps. You will get a free 2-week trial. Again, that's taxhelpsoftware.com, TaxRepTrial, all caps, for a free 2-week trial. If you love it and want to buy it, use TaxRep10, capital, all caps, TAXREP10, TaxRep10, all caps, one word. You'll save 10% on your purchase. It will be the engine that runs your tax rep practice, just like it's what we use for ours. Yes, again, is the Chief of Appeals, Andy Keyso. Andy, thank you for taking the time to do this.
Yeah, my pleasure, Eric. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, there's a lot going on. A lot of stuff in the media, which is rather confusing. 87,000 new auditors, all that kind of nonsense. But I do want to talk to you about funding. Where is appeals in terms of hiring and staffing? I don't suppose that we could talk about this. I don't suppose you're going to be opening new offices or just adding staff to existing. Fast Track Mediation, which I've actually used and used well. And just kind of just what's going on in appeals, because COVID, the shutdown. I think there's a lot of people interested in kind of where we are.
Yeah.
So with all that, I guess sort of, what is the impact on the Independent Office of Appeals in terms of the new funding?
Yeah, okay. All good points that you raised there. I hope we can get to all of them. I think starting with the funding, as you know, the Congress passed and the President signed that Inflation Reduction Act, providing significant funding for the agency. And the agency has developed, of course, a strategic plan for moving forward with that money. From the perspective of appeals, I think we see a lot of good in the plan for spending that money, even where it's not directly related to an appeal. So let me talk about what I mean by that. I think directly affecting appeals is the hiring. As you've heard across the agency, it'll be to staff up a bit more, and we in appeals are certainly part of that group. So we are at about 1,530 or so employees today in appeals. And that's higher than where we've been for a number of years. We were at 1,100, 1,200 employees not terribly long ago. And I think what happens when you see the number of employees dip, but the workload continues to come in, it can take longer to work a case. And I think from the taxpayer experience perspective, we think taxpayers deserve a quality appeals review of their case when it comes here. But also a timely appeals review. And I think by increasing staffing, more people to spread the work out among, we will be able to do better on the time it takes to appeal a case. Speaking of that issue, back when the COVID hit, I told our folks I was extremely proud of appeals for being able to continue to conduct appeals hearings throughout COVID. We didn't do it in person, of course. We couldn't sit across the table from each other, but we did significantly increase our use of video conferences. And so much like the public in general, who got more used to video conferences, our appeals officers did as well. And we continue to offer video conferences as a type of conference going forward for taxpayers who want it. We also are back now, of course, to doing in-person conferences where we sit across a desk from each other, and we've always done conferences by telephone. So taxpayers have those options as to how they best want to interact with their appeals officer. So I think hiring, as I say, we're about 1,530 employees today. I hope to continue that hiring through the rest of this year and into next year to staff up to maybe the 1,700 employee level, which I think is about right for appeals. So that's how the law and the funding directly affect appeals. But to turn to indirect benefits to appeals, if you look at that IRS strategic plan for spending the money, you see a lot of good stuff in there that's kind of internal to the agency, but really improves the taxpayer experience. It's paperless case files. It's electronic communications between taxpayers and practitioners and the agency, right? And it's things like enterprise case management. So to take a step backwards here, the agency in a lot of respects continues to operate as it did in the 20th century. If an audit is done on a taxpayer or a collection action is taken on a taxpayer, traditionally a paper case file was involved. And then that paper case file would get shipped to appeals if the taxpayer wants to have an appeals hearing, right? We've made good strides during the pandemic and afterward in this agency of becoming more paperless. And you've seen the commissioner and the Treasury Secretary talk about how that is a big priority. And we're thrilled by that in appeals, because rather than having to ship cases from the auditor or the revenue officer taking the collection action, the cases can get zapped here electronically, which is a big deal for us. So we are just optimistic about that process improving with the additional funding. I think also the additional funding creating electronic communication, easier electronic communication between taxpayers, practitioners, and the IRS is great. You know, a portal where taxpayers can go on, exchange documents with appeals electronically, or, we can send secure email back and forth is really the way we ought to be communicating. It was in the news during the pandemic about the paper that got mailed into the IRS and sat because there weren't people around for a period of time. Electronic communications, don't have that same fate. So I think that that's great. And then third and lastly, the enterprise case management, right? Across the agency, this is kind of in the weeds, but across the agency, each function has its own database where it tracks its cases. If the agency had one database, it does make things move more smoothly from one step to the other. All of that, I think, improves the taxpayer experience for a timely appeal. So those are a lot of the things that we look forward to seeing implemented over the next few years here with that funding.
Yeah, and for the audience, it's a big deal to professionals. So as an example, what happens if notice of deficiency comes out? We file in tax court. We will get an answer back, Andy, in 45 days, basically admitting name and address, and a notice of deficiency was issued, and then denying everything else, which, by the way, upsets clients to no end. Why are they calling me a liar? No, they don't even have the file. And counsel has to respond, so they blanket deny everything. Then it'll get over to appeals, where you'll get a letter from an appeals officer, call the appeals officer, they don't even have the file yet. So now I'm explaining to the appeals officer and faxing them a copy. If all of that were in one database and they all had access to the records, cases would move faster. I wouldn't be refaxing documents, over and over again, one to counsel, one to appeals. No, I think it's a terrific idea. It does take, though, an upgrading of the system to enable that to happen, which is why the funding is so important. It annoys me when the media picked up on this nonsense of 87,000 new auditors. And, as I've been explaining, it's really across the board, the mail getting opened, the electronic updates that need updates, really bringing the whole thing into the 21st century that needs to be done. But also having more appeals officers because of the brain drain that's been going on with the IRS for the last 10 years. The last thing for the audience, if you're dealing with appeals and you've sent something to audit, although this sounds great and eventually they'll have everything, when I submit my appeals, I include copies of what I think that appeals officers need, the appeals officer needs to see. Don't assume that they're going to wait, get a file, go searching for something. If something is critical, this is why we're entitled, let's say, to the deduction. I've enclosed copies of what we provided to the auditor. Make their job easy
to review it versus now send them on a chase to go find the stuff. Eventually, it sounds like maybe all that'll be sorted out electronically, but until then, that is sort of critical. And this is for those of us who would do a lot of work with appeals. This is like heaven, right? Everything, if counsel and appeals and everyone had access to the same thing, because the other problem, Andy, is let's say we don't hear from appeals. Now I'm calling the counsel attorney. They don't know where it is either. So now they have to go hunt down what happened to the case. If everything were all tied in together, it would make life easier. Yep, it's been assigned to so-and-so. Here's their contact number. If you don't hear from them, call them. It
should be so simple, doesn't it? It should be so simple for an agency this size. And as you point out, with the technology, it is a big undertaking. But I think this funding allows the agency to do it. And I feel as optimistic about it as I ever have that it will get done. And we'll get into, the modern era of electronic communication and seamless electronic transfer of cases and a database where you say, as you say, at any point, someone from appeals or counsel or from one of the audit functions could look up and find the status of a case. So I really am optimistic about it.
So where is the case inventory now? Because at one point it was very backed up. It feels like we're getting to appeals faster now, or at least we're hearing from them faster. Has the inventory gotten back to, I don't want to say normal levels, but where they were pre-COVID?
Close to it, not entirely back to where we were pre-COVID, but close to it. So during COVID, we did see a slowdown in cases overall. I think prior to COVID, we would receive in appeals maybe 80,000 cases a year or so. And during COVID, that dropped down to 55, 65,000 cases a year, just because everything slowed down in the pipeline. That has built back up to 75,000 cases or so for the most recent year. I'm delighted to hear your recent experience has been things have moved more quickly. I think the agency certainly after COVID got back into sending things over to appeals that needed to come to appeals, and we found that flow is working as normal again. So it really can depend on the type of case that you have coming to appeals. Lately, we've noticed that our inventory is down below average on the collection stream of cases. So the collection due process hearings that we're doing, the offer and compromise cases, those types of things. And the examination inventory is higher than that. So it really depends on the type of case that you'll see how fast it moves into appeals.
Well, and that makes sense because the automated enforcement has been turned off.
Right.
So those taxpayers who would have gotten final notices and the automated substitute for returns that would have triggered notice of deficiency, those must be down as well. So that you're right, the pipeline is lower, so that's why. I suspect that's going to ramp up pretty quickly, though.
I suspect that's right, and we factor that into our hiring. And we take advantage of when inventories are lower, certainly doing more training for our people, doing some hiring and having existing people help train those new hires that are coming on. So I think, speaking about the benefits of the funding, principally hiring, will be where we expect to see the numbers that we need to keep up with any increased pace in collection work once collection notices begin going out and there are more levy or lien actions. You've also seen in the strategic plan for spending that money, it talks about increased focus on enforcement in the area of large corporate taxpayers, large partnerships, and high income individuals or high wealth individuals. And so we need to be prepared for that in appeals. If we're going to see more of those types of cases coming to appeals, do we hire more appeals officers who can work those types of cases? And what we've been doing, Eric, is a bit of a recruiting push here, where we will hold recruiting events over the internet. And I've spoken at a couple of them, and we've had tremendous numbers of people, multiple hundreds or over 1,000 in a few cases of people who get on just to hear what is appeals about and what job opportunities are available in appeals. And we talk about the appeals officer job and whether you're, right out of school, out of college with maybe an accounting or tax background, or you're a mid-career person who's been working in an accounting firm, or even a later career and you've got many decades behind you and now you want to come into the government, we in appeals can accommodate all of those different levels of background of people. And we encourage folks to go to the usajobs.gov website and search for appeals positions on there. You'll find appeals officer jobs, you'll find settlement officer jobs there, and any other number of the support jobs, as you point out, that are necessary to keep appeals functioning.
One comment, and I've mentioned this to Darren Gio, the centralized innocent spouse group, because economic hardship is one of the factors they're supposed to consider. There is no revenue officer assigned to that group. There's no settlement officer assigned. And I think that's sort of a mistake. I've mentioned to Darren, if there were a way when we've raised, because we've had people, Andy, we go to appeals on the innocent spouse, it's Section 8, their RCP for collection is 0. Government's never going to collect it. So aside from the fact we think there's a very good argument for innocent spouse, they're supposed to consider economic hardship. I find that they don't. And they'll say, well, look, you can go do an offer and compromise later. The IRM is like, that's supposed to be considered. You may want to consider that idea. Is there a way to assign a few settlement officers when that's raised so they could review it? And if they come to the conclusion, look, we're not collecting anything from this person, can we just resolve this now versus starting a whole new process to tie up more people? That would be helpful, just as Eric Green's 2 cents on the matter.
Yeah, I appreciate the 2 cents. It's always good to hear comments like that. I know we've looked at it as sort of an analogous situation where a taxpayer comes in through the collections work stream, right? Collection due process hearing, and they're challenging a liability or raising a liability issue. And we think about what's the best way to work that there. Is it to throw the case over the transom to the examination people and have them look at it? Or can we embed people who can get on that more quickly? So what I hear you raising is a similar issue, and I appreciate your 2 cents there on it. It's worth considering.
Yeah, no, and that is what you raised is also an issue. I did speak to Fred Schindler about it, and Fred did mention years ago you had both doubters to liability and doubters to collectability on the same form. The problem, of course, is everyone checked everything and sent it in, which slowed everything down. And my suggestion was, well, Fred, look, if people go doubters to liability, great, but if they raise it as collectability, I think that if appeals looks at it and says, all right, you've submitted information, I have the authority, I can send it over to someone to take a look at, because if we can settle it that way rather than starting all over again, that would be great.
I have noticed that in appeals, you get, appeals officers who feel like, I want to wrap this case up here. I don't want to be sending it back to examination or back to collection. We kind of view it as good taxpayer service if we can conclude the whole case here at this level. And so, yeah, I think people think along those lines, and appreciate your thoughts as to process improvements to sort of facilitate that.
Yeah. Now, one of the other topics we had mentioned was fast track mediation. And for those folks listening who've never used this, it is a process. You request it with audit. You let the auditors know you want fast track mediation. You still have your appeal rights if you can't work it out through mediation. I have to tell you, Andy, so I used this recently. It worked brilliantly. We got to a solution fairly quickly. One of the factors I'm going to just, for the audience, it works if you have to have a taxpayer that is willing to work out a deal. And I'll give you an example. So I had a client, got audited. They had foreign bank accounts, they didn't realize it was a foreign bank account. It's a foreign bank, but has a branch right in New York. Walking back and forth, they open this account because they go back and forth to Israel, but it's a foreign bank account. They never report it. Since then, they closed it. They end up getting audited. The auditors, there were some legitimate adjustments. They realized this. Now, it's beyond 6 years. They can't charge the FBAR penalty, but they hit them for the fraud penalty. And this went on so long with COVID, the 3-year ASET, which is the audit statute, had gone. So I spoke to the client who said, there's no fraud. This is nonsense. they have to give that up. I said, they can't give it up. If they give it up, the whole case is gone. Really what was bothering them was the 75% fraud penalty. We requested fast track mediation. We get the group manager and the territory manager. And what happens is, for the people listening, the appeals officer literally is going to act as mediator. The taxpayer presents their side, the government listens, they present their side, and then both sides kind of go into separate Zoom rooms, if you will, and kind of try to come to a conclusion. I will say, depending who the appeals officer goes into the room with, you kind of have a sense of where they're coming out on this. They're going to tell the taxpayer, look, you're not being reasonable here. Or they'll tell the government, not a bad deal. Can we, resolve this? Oh, by the way, you have to block out the whole day. It starts in the morning. You're not done until you're done. So just FYI for the audience. We had talked to our client, and we went when we met with the government, Andy. What I told the client, and thankfully they were reasonable, they can't give up the fraud penalty because they lose the whole thing. You might as well just say, we win, you lose, give up. That's not a mediation. That's nonsense. You're going to go litigate. I said, they have the authority, to adjust the penalty. Why don't we concede to the fraud penalty, but ask it be reduced to 20%, in line with the accuracy? And the client said, do you think they'll go for it? I said, well, I don't think 20%, but I think that's a good starting point. And it's not unreasonable because we can lay out the arguments why we don't believe there's any fraud. The government listened, and we conceded to other things that we had issues with, but honestly, the government was correct. We confirmed it. The government came back and said, we can't settle for 20%, but we would take 35%. Our client agreed, and that was the end of it. We settled that case, which otherwise was going to get litigated. The taxpayer's bill got cut by more than half. They were thrilled. The government, we got it settled. It worked really well, but I think the secret there was we had a client who was willing to concede things to try to get to a resolution. If you have a client that doesn't, that's a problem. And yes, you can have an auditor that doesn't, but honestly, Andy, in the one that we had, and I don't know if auditors are supposed to be in, we didn't have the auditor. It was literally it was the supervisor and the territory manager, which honestly, I think made it easier because we didn't have someone who was emotionally, all, fired up about it, right? Which sometimes auditors really feel very strongly about the work they've done. This worked much better without them. But I don't know if you can tell me, are auditors supposed to be in the mediation?
Well, yeah, mediation, of course, the traditional way that we in appeals work cases is that an examination is performed by the auditor, the revenue agent, the tax compliance officer. If the taxpayer does not agree to the examination results, they can ask to come to appeals, and the case is sent over to appeals, and the taxpayer or the practitioner just meets with an appeals officer and says, okay, the appeals officer is looking at both sides of the case. We're independent from the exam function. We're impartial. We're looking at the legal arguments on both sides, and we propose a settlement to the taxpayer. That's the traditional appeals model. As you point out, the mediation model, which is given the name fast track here at the IRS, but the mediation model occurs before the examiner sends the case over to appeals. We in appeals sort of drop into the case while it's still in exam, and our role there is one of mediator. So it's a three-party. It's intended to be a three-party, the taxpayer and their representative on one side, and the examining agent, the revenue agent, or as you say in your example, the manager of the revenue agent on the other side, with the appeals officer there as a mediator. Trying to bring the two sides to some compromised position based on what are the hazards to each side. And our appeals officers are given training in how to be mediators. I think it's a very good training, to operate as a neutral or to point out where each side faces its challenge. But as you point out, Eric, it requires the parties to be willing to budge from their positions. So mediation is not going to work if one side or the other is unwilling to budge from its position. I always think there can be emotion in these things, right? And so it may depend on, the ability of the practitioner or the manager on the IRS exam side to say, let's go in with an open mind and perhaps be willing to settle this. It's a funny thing. Mediation or fast track is something we are focusing on right now. The Government Accountability Office, or GAO, came in and did a report recently that focused on our mediation processes, and they noted that of those cases I mentioned earlier, we work 75,000 or 80,000 cases a year. How many of them are the traditional appeals model versus mediation? By far, most of them are the traditional appeals model, and only a couple hundred a year are mediation cases. So there is a very small uptake in mediation or fast track. And I'm glad that you do it, Eric. I wish others would do it, but I've got a process underway now where we have put out a request for public comment. Was in the news media just within the last few weeks to say, we invite taxpayers or practitioners to give us your thoughts on mediation and how it could be used more frequently, or how could it be improved if you think there are shortcomings with the current process. I'll tell you some things I've heard from practitioners. Some will say, well, I've been working with this examination team or this revenue agent for, X number of months on this audit. I think we're kind of tired of each other, and I really just want to come to appeals and just talk with the appeals officer. I don't want to work anymore with the IRS examiner, right? Or I've heard the sides at the exam level are too far apart and they don't think they would ever be able to mediate a solution, right? So I've heard various things anecdotally, but I welcome, any other comments from the public on this as to, what could make alternative dispute resolution or mediation more productive in the agency, because I really do have an open mind to it. Is it that you think, we need to mandate mediation in certain cases? Are there certain types of issues where mediation is more productive than other types of issues? For instance, valuation cases. Is it particularly useful where the issue is solely one of valuation or transfer pricing, perhaps? I think that when we see most people who come in for mediation, they tend to be the larger corporate taxpayers. And I wonder to myself, what about smaller businesses or individuals? Are they just not aware that mediation is an option? What about low-income tax clinics? Do they ever request mediation, or could they make more use of mediation? So these are things we'll be studying internally here. And I hope by the end of this year, have some thoughts out there to the public about, hey, we're going to pilot or test a program for mediation that does this or does that. But, in the early stages right now of information gathering.
I think part of it is education. I think there are a lot of accountants that aren't aware of it. Part of it depends on, Andy, one of the things that we do see, and I don't know that it's anyone's fault, there's less than a year left. The auditor goes right to notice of deficiency. And so one is there's really no, sometimes there's not an opportunity, but also I think it really does depend on the issue. In my case that I discussed, I felt that the fraud was an issue, the argument about fraud, if we were willing to just look at the percentage and not argue to give it up because the government couldn't. It seemed to me like the kind of thing that if I could just sit down at the table, we could get this resolved and be done with it. Versus, we've had this with appraisals where they just say, you didn't do it timely, reject it outright. I'm not so sure I would bother with mediation because they've made it very clear they're giving nothing. And at this point, then, you know what, we're probably going to litigation. So it depends on the issue. Part of it, I do think, is education, and some of it is just timing. I think that, and hopefully now that we're past COVID, audits will get done faster, and that the timing issue, it was raining notices of deficiency during COVID. That sort of has gone, not away, but it's much, much less. So I think maybe that'll improve things. In terms of just before we run out of time, In terms of training, yeah, I know you mentioned that you get, spend more time on training. You are hiring. I've noticed, by the way, more attorneys are showing up at appeals. I've been dealing with people that actually have law degrees who are fairly new that apparently have decided rather than leave private practice, they'd rather go to work, for the government. One is you already mentioned, improved training, but I don't think the government's going to start reversing the trend where it closed a lot of offices. So on the one hand, I'm like, gee, it'd be nice if we had more local offices, but on the flip side, with the video hearings, are you finding that taxpayers seem pretty happy with the fact that they can do this via video versus being able to walk in and sit at the table?
Yes, I think that generally is right. And of course, it depends on the particular case and the particular practitioner. And do they really want to sit across the table, or is there documents they want to show? I'm a strong believer that it should be the taxpayer's choice as to how do they want to meet with us: telephone, video conference, or sitting across a table. If a taxpayer wants to sit across the table, we traditionally have made that available by traveling to a mutually convenient location. So, maybe we have an office in Denver, the taxpayer's in Wyoming, they're willing to travel to Denver, and we'll travel someone to Denver if we don't have someone there already with that expertise. So we will try to accommodate that for sure. I think the point you make about seeing more attorneys in appeals, yeah, as in part, that's just a function of additional hiring, but trying to look for quality applicants both from internal sources, the rest of the IRS, but also outside sources as well. Those folks bring a different perspective in, and maybe they've been practicing at an accounting firm or in a corporate environment and now want to come into appeals. It's great to have those folks in here. I really think we need a mix of people, not hiring all of our appeals officers from inside the agency, but going outside as well. And I think the burden is on us to train these folks, whether they come from inside the agency or outside. What we've done this year is step up our training. We call it the art of the conference training. The most important thing we do in appeals is hold conferences with taxpayers and their practitioners. Are we listening to the taxpayer and practitioner? Are we engaging with them as to what are the hazards to both sides here if this case were to be litigated? And are we making good judgments about those hazards? To me, that's all part of a quality conference. And are we working the case timely? So we have done some training this year we call Art of the Conference. That's a continuing process. For the bulk of this year, we're doing it multiple times to catch different groups of people. And I think that's a good thing. I also have started inviting practitioners to join us for some of our training and to be on a panel with some of our appeals folks and to discuss particular issues. So we did a couple last year, focusing generally on the examination appeals process or the collection appeals process. Those are posted on our website, by the way, at irs.gov under appeals, the appeals main page. You can see them. We call them the Practitioner Perspectives series, and you can watch them. They're rather lengthy, hour and a half long, I think, a discussion with practitioners about what do you look for when you come to appeals. We recorded one a few weeks ago on, it's a two-part panel on penalties, working penalty cases in appeals, and I anticipate having those posted to irs.gov shortly. But I think, again, in the way of training for our folks or giving our folks access to the best information, we bring practitioners in, put them on a panel with some appeals folks and say, let's talk about Section 6751B, managerial approval of penalties, or let's talk about the Farhi decision in the tax court about the ability to assess certain international penalties. And it really is a good airing of issues. And I've heard from our appeals officers, they like hearing that perspective, and it's certainly helpful in the way of continuing education. So we will continue to do that this year and into next in terms of training these new people that we're bringing on.
Yeah, no, it's been great when we have an appeals officer who has real world experience. I've had the instance where it was an audit of a contractor who had multiple crews going. So his mileage, as you can imagine, is insane, like 100,000 miles a year because he's driving around. And audit rejected it. It was ridiculous. We go to appeals. The appeals officer had worked for someone years ago who had that similar setup. He said, no, I know exactly what's going on. And we talked about it. We had a great conversation. There were some adjustments, but we came out really where it should have been. And I remember thinking, wow, if I get an appeals officer who had experience in every case, this would be much easier. But no, it is great to have folks, I think, come in mid. I mean, that was the benefit years ago where they had all been auditors. When I started practicing, the appeals officers, because I had more senior partners who had been at IRS trial counsel, so they knew the appeals officers back when they were revenue agents. And so they just had a wealth of experience. You showed up and we just got to an answer, I think the right answer, a lot faster. They weren't out to just deny everything. They say, look, all right, here's what's going on. I agree with this, don't agree with this. And that's the way I thought appeals worked. We just got everything settled. I never tried a tax court case. It's sort of swung the other way now where we tend to have auditors that are much more aggressive, but new, whatever. But it's nice to have people coming in mid-career if you do have them, because they do have experience from outside, and I find it helpful.
Yeah, we're fortunate. We get those folks from outside, and we get folks from the internal there are still folks out there internally built their career up as auditors. They know what is really an issue worth focusing on and what is de minimis or not to be bothered with. And so I like the fact that we're able to attract all of those folks, external and internal, good internal and good external candidates into appeals. It's something we'll continue to do here and make the push for. It can be harder to bring people in from outside the agency. It's just, a more challenging hiring process, and applicants have to be patient, with us. We don't interview you on Friday and tell you, can you start Monday? There's, certain bureaucratic machinations that we have to go through to get that to happen. And I know applicants from the outside say, I've got another job or two waiting for me. I need to know from you. And so that's the challenge I really face, Eric, with hiring folks from the outside, but we persevere with it.
Yeah, no. So Andy, if anyone wanted to volunteer to be on one of your practitioner panels or wanted to reach out to you, is there a way to contact appeals?
I would say folks should just email me. It's andrew.j.keyso, Keyso at irs.gov, G-O-V. I always look forward to hearing from practitioners, particularly about their experiences with appeals or, suggestions for how we can improve.
Yep. Okay. I will put your email in the description. Andy, listen, thank you for taking the time. Great update. I'm glad to see the inventory time coming down, because we had cases. In fact, I had called you about hunting one down. Remember during COVID that went we lost it somewhere, but no, we're seeing on our end, we're seeing the improvement, and it's great. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Eric, and to be with you here. And thank you for your remarks about appeals, too.
All right. No, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's podcast. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye.